Hi everyone, welcome back to LB 326B, the 19th century transformation of Western medicine. This is module 4A. In the last module, we talked about cholera, and the work that John Snow did in surmising that cholera is something that is ingested orally. Snow also showed that there are patterns that cholera follows, and that water supply had something to do with these patterns. But he was unable to find and name the specific mechanism by which the disease was caused and spread. In other words, he couldn't find the germ. In this module, we're going to be learning about the germ theory of disease. In a sense, it's taken us half the course to reach the period when we begin to see the development of what we all would probably recognize as scientific modern medicine, which is the germ theory. Let's reconsider the momentous developments over the course of the long 19th century. Before the French Revolution in 1789 and the subsequent developments within the Paris School of Medicine, you'll remember that the conceptual framework was dominated still by that of Hippocrates, Galen, and humoral medicine. But by the dawn of the 19th century, Galenic humoral medicine was starting to retreat. Doctors now absorbed ideas from the Paris school, like tissue pathology and disease specificity and disease categorization, which we would call nosology. But the overarching medical philosophy that epidemic diseases were caused by poisonous air or miasma remained, in spite of the Paris school advancements. However, by the end of the 19th century, Galenic humoral medicine and miasmatic theory both had dramatically collapsed under the weight of scientific evidence. By the end of the 19th century, the germ theory of disease becomes the only accepted medical and scientific explanation for disease causation, and the central focus of medical research moves from the clinic to the laboratory. The idea of disease specificity that was crucial to the Paris School of Medicine was also critical in leading to the development of the germ theory. Any further progress to the idea of a microbial disease depended upon the view that diseases didn't transform from one into another. Before the Paris School, it was common to believe, for example, that cholera, to take one disease, was simply a heightened form of endemic summer diarrhea. It wasn't a specific disease. It grew out of another disease or out of another pre-existing condition. The germ theory depended instead on the conviction that there are stable, unchanging disease entities, that each one is specific and has a specific microbial cause. But the doctors involved in the Paris School, while carefully distinguishing one disease from another and classifying them, did not advance much towards the idea of the causative pathogens behind them. So what can account for the dramatic collapse of Galenic humoral medicine, which was a system that had lasted for almost 2,000 years? Who were the key scientists, and what were the decisive events that gave rise to the modern era of germs? To answer this question, we will examine the works of two men, Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch. In the first half of the 19th century, one of the most contested debates in science concerned the role of spontaneous generation. Spontaneous generation is the idea that diseases somehow arise spontaneously in a particular locality. They are not brought in or imported from the outside. The sudden appearance of a disease is almost a magical process that's caused by some sort of corruption of the air or of some other element. Another way to think of this is to just picture a hunk of meat. Let's say we put this hunk of meat on a plate and we sit that plate to the side. In several days, if we go back and examine the meat, we will discover that it's teeming with maggots. Now, where did the maggots come from? Of course, we understand that somehow a fly's eggs were deposited in the meat and that this gave rise to the maggots. But to people of the early 19th century, this was a perfect example of spontaneous generation. In their minds, the maggots just poof, popped into life spontaneously. They didn't come from flies, they didn't come from eggs, they came from the rotting meat itself. It was the corruption of the rotting flesh that made the maggots just pop into existence. And if maggots can just pop up in stinky meat, why can't disease just pop up in stinky air? In other words, the miasmatic theory. So this is the theory of spontaneous generation. So mice are not necessarily born from other living mice. Mice come from a mixture of some dirty shirts, maybe some wheat sprinkled on them. You leave it for 21 days, and you come back, and you have mice. Frogs don't come from tadpoles. They come from mud. Flies don't necessarily come from maggots or from eggs. They just come from rotting flesh. So the idea is that living things can arise or spontaneously generate out of dead matter. With regard to cholera, which we've discussed extensively, we know that there was an intense debate about where cholera came from. Most people believe that cholera was a miasmatic disease that just popped up or spontaneously generated in areas of organic decay and rotting stench. We've already discussed how John Snow pushed back against this idea and claimed that cholera was actually something. He didn't know what, but something in the water that got ingested into the body. And it was this unknown something that caused the disease cholera. He's hinting at, but cannot prove, the presence of what we would call germs. Well, about the same time that Snow is thinking about these things in England, over in France, Pasteur is also thinking that this theory of spontaneous generation seems somehow a bit incomplete. So one day, Pasteur, just sitting in his laboratory, saw the sun shining in through the window and noticed all of the tiny little particles that float in the air, these little floaty things. And this gave him an idea that maybe the cause of putrefaction or disease was actually one of these little things that was floating around in the air around us. So to prove this theory that there's something about these floaty things in the air that is causing corruption or infection, Pasteur conducted what became known as the swan neck flask experiments. In this experiment, Pasteur put chicken broth into several sterilized flasks, which he then boiled to make the solution sterile. Some of the flasks he left open and uncovered. In these flasks, scum began to form on the surface after a couple of days. But for the other flasks, he used a heating implement to make the glass malleable, and he bent the necks of the flasks into a large U-shaped curve, like a swan's neck. So the broth in these flasks was technically still open to the air, but they were also protected from the floaty things that Pasteur had seen in the air around him. And in these flasks, the broth remained uncorrupted. No scum formed. However, when Pasteur broke off the neck, thus exposing the broth to the floaty things in the air, scum grew in a few days. This experiment showed Pasteur several things. One, that there's no such thing as spontaneous generation. The broth that was protected and covered never became scummy and corrupted. The experiment also showed that there were specific things in the air that caused the scum to form. Events that in the past seemed to have supported the idea of spontaneous generation could now be explained as fermentation or putrefaction caused by a specific microbe that had landed on whatever was now rotting. The fermentation or infection that is visible is a direct result of the metabolic process of the microbe. Now, the practical implications of Pasteur's experiment showing that these floaty things in the air are actually causing specific infections can be seen in an experiment done by the English physician and surgeon, Dr. Joseph Lister. So let's take a brief look at Dr. Lister. So Dr. Lister, who's known as the father of modern surgery, was a practicing physician in England in the mid and late 19th century. Lister was very interested in the work of Louis Pasteur, especially the swan neck flask experiments, and the idea that there was something in the air that caused putrefaction in an otherwise sterile zone. As a country doctor, Lister saw many broken bones, especially compound fractures, where the bone pierces through the skin. He also saw other flesh wounds that were the result of farming accidents. So most of these injuries did not heal. They became septic, and the patient would die of sepsis or gangrene. Thinking about Pasteur's experiments, Lister decided to do an experiment of his own. On some patients who presented with an open wound or a compound fracture, Lister did as he would normally do. He sewed up the wound and he sent the patient home. These patients, more often than not, would die of sepsis or gangrene. However, in some patients, Lister, thinking about these floaty things in the air, tried to protect the patient's wound from these things. To do this, he misted the air around the wound with carbolic acid, or phenol, and then lightly covered the wound with a bandage. The rate of recovery was amazing. Lister went one step further and decided to take the same approach when performing minor surgeries. Remember, a minor surgery prior to the late 19th century usually meant sure infection and death. But Lister, before cutting, would mist the air with carbolic acid and continue the misting procedure until the operation was complete. Once completed, the incision was lightly covered. The rates of infection were dramatically lower than in patients operated upon without the cleansing mist. Lister published his results, and those in the medical profession quickly realized that he was right. These floaty things in the air, which were later called microbes or germs, could be killed by the phenol mist, and thus the patients were protected from infection. So Pasteur was correct. It was the specific floaty things in the air that are all around us that cause infection and disease. The experiments of Pasteur and Lister led to doctors around the world using carbolic mist or phenol to sterilize their operating theaters and also to sterilize instruments, use rubber gloves and aprons. These floating microbes needed to be killed or avoided to protect the patient from sepsis and death. A common joke at the end of the 19th century was that instead of saying, "let us pray" at the beginning of an operation, surgeons began to say, "let us spray."